The truth is, the person you're trying to let go of may not be the reason you're suffering. That sounds impossible at first, because if you've been emotionally attached to someone for months, maybe years, every instinct tells you that they are the source of the pain. Their absence hurts, their inconsistency hurts, their rejection hurts, their indifference hurts. So naturally, it seems obvious that if they changed, you would finally feel better. But what if that isn't true? What if the thing keeping you emotionally dependent has almost nothing to do with them? What if the real source of your suffering is something far closer? Something so close that you've been looking through it your entire life without realizing it was there. And what makes this difficult is that emotional dependency rarely feels like dependency. It feels like love. It feels like connection. It feels like caring deeply. It feels noble, meaningful. Human, perhaps you've noticed this. You tell yourself that you simply miss them, that you simply care more than most people, that your feelings are proof of how genuine your heart is. And yet, despite all of that, something strange keeps happening. You think about them when you don't want to. You replay conversations long after they've ended. You analyze text messages. You wonder what they're thinking. You imagine what you could have said differently. You create entire futures in your mind, then destroy those futures with a single fear. What if they don't want me? What if they're moving on? What if I've already lost them? And this is where most people get stuck because they assume the problem is attachment. So they try to force themselves not to care. They distract themselves. They suppress their emotions. They try to become cold, detached, unavailable. They tell themselves they're done. And then a single message arrives, a photo, a memory, a notification. And suddenly they're right back where they started, not because they failed, but because they were trying to solve the wrong problem. Most people don't realize that emotional dependency is not created by love, it is created by identity. And until you understand that distinction, every attempt to become free will feel temporary, because the issue was never the person, the issue was what the person came to represent. Think about that carefully. The person is not just a person anymore. They have become a symbol of approval, a symbol of worth, a symbol of security, a symbol of being chosen. And when someone becomes a symbol of your value, losing them no longer feels like losing a relationship. It feels like losing yourself. That is why emotional dependency feels so overwhelming. You are not grieving the absence of another person. You are grieving the version of yourself that only exists when they validate you. The strange thing is that most people never see this happening. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A glance becomes attention. Attention becomes significance. Significance becomes attachment. Attachment becomes identity. And eventually your emotional state begins, depending on factors completely outside your control. Whether they text, whether they call, whether they approve, whether they stay, whether they choose you. And every time they do, you feel elevated. Every time they don't, you feel diminished. Now ask yourself something. If another person's behavior has the power to determine your value, who actually possesses your power? You do not need to answer immediately, because that question is more dangerous than it appears. Most people spend years avoiding it. Because if the answer is not comforting, if the answer is that you handed your sense of worth to another person, then you must also confront a second realization. You were never powerless. You were participating, not consciously, not intentionally, but participation nonetheless. Neville Goddard often spoke about self concept. Today, that phrase is repeated so frequently that many people no longer hear it. It has become familiar. And familiarity has a way of hiding significance. But self concept is not merely positive thinking. It is not affirmations. It is not pretending. Self concept is the deepest assumption you hold about who you are. It is the invisible identity from which all your emotions emerge. Imagine two people receiving the exact same rejection. One person feels devastated. The other feels disappointed but remains grounded. The event is identical. The emotional outcome is completely different. Why? Because events do not create emotional dependency. Identity does. And this is the first major shift. The thing that hurts you is rarely the event itself. It is what the event appears to say about you. Rejection feels painful because it appears to say, you are not enough. Being ignored feels painful because it appears to say, you are not important. Being abandoned feels painful because it appears to say, you are not worthy of staying for. Notice the pattern. Every painful experience eventually becomes a statement about self. And once that happens, emotional dependency becomes inevitable. Because now you are not seeking another person, you are seeking evidence that you are enough. Perhaps you've noticed how exhausting this becomes. You monitor their behavior, you search for clues, you interpret signals, you become a detective investigating your own worth. A delayed response means something, a short message means something, a different tone means something. Everything becomes evidence, everything becomes proof, everything becomes a verdict. And this is where emotional dependency quietly transforms into emotional imprisonment. Because you can never feel secure while another person controls the evidence you rely on to determine your value. The prison is invisible, but it is still a prison. Now, here is where things become interesting because the solution is not to stop loving, the solution is not to stop caring, the solution is not emotional numbness. In fact, those approaches often make the problem worse. Because emotional dependency is not the presence of love, it is the absence of self possession. That distinction changes everything. Love and dependency are not the same thing. They simply feel similar from the inside. One comes from fullness, the other comes from lack. One says, I enjoy your presence. The other says, I need your presence. One says, I appreciate you. The other says, I require you. And although those statements sound similar, psychologically they originate from completely different identities. This brings us to a realization that most people spend years avoiding. The relationship you have with yourself determines the relationship you have with everyone else, not the other way around. Most people believe confidence comes after being chosen. But what if being chosen was never the cause? What if it was merely a temporary symptom? What if the confidence disappeared whenever the external validation disappeared because it never truly belonged to you? And if that's true, then a far bigger question emerges. If another person's approval cannot permanently create your worth, can another person's rejection permanently destroy it? That question may be the beginning of your freedom. Because in the next part, we're going to uncover the hidden mechanism that causes people to unconsciously hand their emotional power away in the first place. And more importantly, why almost everyone is trying to solve emotional dependency backwards. Most people believe emotional dependency begins when they meet the wrong person. The truth is far more unsettling. It begins long before they ever meet anyone. It begins with a question so old that many people no longer hear it consciously. Am I enough? The strange thing is that almost every major emotional struggle eventually traces back to this single uncertainty. Not because people consciously think those words every day, but because their behavior quietly reveals the question underneath. Why do some people desperately seek approval? Why do they overthink text messages? Why do they tolerate disrespect? Why do they become obsessed with being chosen? Why do they fear abandonment more than almost anything else? Different behaviors, different stories, same question, am I enough? And this is where most people misunderstand emotional dependency. They think dependency happens because someone is important. But importance alone cannot create dependency. Dependency occurs when another person becomes responsible for answering a question you have not answered yourself. Think about that carefully. The person you cannot let go of often holds something far more valuable than affection. They hold reassurance, they hold certainty, they hold temporary relief from self doubt. When they choose you, the question disappears. For a moment, when they validate you, the question disappears. For a moment, when they desire you, the question disappears. For a moment. And because that relief feels incredible, the mind begins associating the person with emotional survival. This is not love. It is psychological conditioning. The same mechanism that creates many forms of dependency. Reward, relief, reward, relief, reward, relief. Over time, the brain learns a dangerous lesson. My emotional state depends on them. Now something fascinating begins happening. This relationship is no longer experienced objectively. It becomes distorted by need. Perhaps you've noticed this. Someone gives you attention, you feel energized. Someone pulls away, you feel anxious. Someone approves of you. You feel valuable. Someone criticizes you. You feel diminished. At first, this seems normal. But hidden underneath is a profound misunderstanding. You have begun confusing emotional reactions with personal truth. And those are not the same thing. Just because something hurts does not mean it defines you. Just because someone leaves does not mean you are unworthy. Just because someone rejects you does not mean you are inadequate. Yet emotional dependency convinces you otherwise. It transforms temporary experiences into permanent conclusions. And this is where suffering becomes self perpetuating. Because once you believe your worth is uncertain, you start behaving differently. You become cautious, hyper aware, anxious, you monitor everything, you seek reassurance, you chase certainty. Ironically, these behaviors often create the very outcomes you fear. Not because the universe is punishing you, not because you are unlucky, but because identity influences behavior, behavior influences relationships, relationships reflect identity. Neville pointed toward this repeatedly. Although many people miss the deeper implication, the world reflects the assumptions you hold about yourself. Modern psychology describes something remarkably similar. People unconsciously seek experiences that confirm existing beliefs, even painful ones, especially painful ones. If someone secretly believes they are not enough, they will often become attracted to situations that repeatedly force them to confront that belief, not intentionally, subconsciously. The mind prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. That sounds absurd until you begin noticing it. Why do people repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners? Why do they stay in relationships that drain them? Why do they continue chasing individuals who consistently withhold affection? Because the situation feels familiar. And familiarity often disguises itself as attraction. This is where most people get stuck. They think they're attached to a person. In reality, they're attached to a pattern that keeps recreating an identity they already believe. The pattern feels personal, but it isn't. It's psychological. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that it feels convincing. When someone ignores you, your emotions immediately produce a story. When someone pulls away, your mind creates meaning. When someone loses interest, your imagination fills in the blanks. Most people assume these stories are reality. But what if they're not? What if the pain is not coming from what happened? What if it is coming from the interpretation? That possibility changes everything. Because if interpretation creates suffering, then emotional freedom becomes possible. Not easy, but possible. Imagine two people walking into the same room. One believes they are valuable. The other secretly doubts themselves. The room treats them identically, yet their experiences are completely different. One notices opportunities, the other notices threats. One sees possibility, the other sees judgment. One feels secure, the other feels exposed. The environment is the same, the identity is different, and identity always shapes perception. This is why emotional dependency cannot be solved through willpower. Willpower addresses behavior. Identity creates behavior. Most people attempt to remove symptoms while protecting the cause. They want freedom without changing the assumptions that created the prison. They want confidence without examining insecurity. They want detachment without transforming identity. And this is why they remain stuck. The deeper issue survives, quietly, partly waiting beneath the surface. The strange thing is that emotional dependency often feels strongest when you are closest to freedom, because as the old identity begins losing its grip, it fights to survive. You suddenly miss them more, think about them more, crave reassurance more. The old self becomes louder, not because you're failing, because transformation has begun. Most people interpret this incorrectly. They assume increased emotional discomfort means they're moving backward. Often the opposite is true. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that an old identity is being challenged. And identities rarely disappear peacefully. They resist, they negotiate, they attempt to pull you back into familiar patterns. This is where most people surrender, because they mistake withdrawal symptoms for love. But they are not always the same thing. Ride that again. Many people spend years calling something love that is actually dependency, calling something destiny that is actually conditioning, calling something connection that is actually fear. And until they recognize the difference, they remain trapped. Now we arrive at the turning point, the insight that changes everything. The insight that most people never discover. The person was never the source of your power. They became the container you placed your power into. And what you place into a container can be taken back. Not through force, not through pretending you don't care, not through becoming cold, but through something far more profound, a shift in self concept, a shift so powerful that once it fully clicks, emotional dependency begins dissolving at the root rather than at the surface. And in the next part, we're going to uncover exactly how that shift happens and why it has the power to transform not only your relationships, but your entire reality. There is a moment that changes everything, not a dramatic moment, not the kind people imagine, no lightning, no sudden enlightenment, no instant disappearance of pain. The shift happens much more quietly than that. It begins the moment you stop asking a question you didn't even realize you were asking. The question is this: what do I need to do to make them choose me? At first glance, it seems harmless, reasonable even. But hidden inside that question is an assumption so destructive that entire lives are built around it. The assumption is that your value is still undecided, that your worth remains open for negotiation, that another person possesses information about you that you do not. Think about what that means. Every time you seek validation, you are unconsciously treating someone else as an authority on your value. Every time you need reassurance, you are placing another person above yourself in a hierarchy that should not exist. And this is the breakthrough most people spend years avoiding. The emotional dependency was never created by another person, it was created by an agreement that says, I will decide how I feel about myself based on how you feel about me. That agreement is the prison, not the relationship, not the rejection, not the distance, the agreement, the contract, the invisible arrangement operating beneath conscious awareness. And once you see it, something strange happens. You can never fully unsee it, because suddenly you begin recognizing it everywhere. You see it in relationships, friendships, workplaces, families. So, social media, you begin noticing how often people surrender their emotional state to forces outside themselves. A compliment lifts them, a criticism destroys them, approval energizes them, disapproval devastates them. Entire emotional lives being controlled by external circumstances. Most people call this normal, but normal and healthy are not always the same thing. The strange thing is that human beings were never designed to build identity this way, because anything dependent on external conditions remains permanently unstable. Imagine trying to build a house on moving water. Every wave becomes a threat, every storm becomes a crisis, every disturbance feels catastrophic. Not because the storm is unusually powerful, because the foundation is unstable. And emotional dependency works the same way. Most people spend years trying to stabilize relationships when the real issue is the foundation beneath the relationship. This is where Neville's understanding becomes surprisingly modern, because at the center of his teachings was a radical idea. You do not experience life primarily through circumstances. You experience life through identity. Your assumptions about yourself become the lens through which reality is interpreted. Modern psychology arrives at a similar conclusion from a different direction. Identity shapes perception, perception shapes behavior, behavior shapes outcomes, outcomes reinforce identity, a loop, a cycle, a self-conserving system. Now here's the realization that changes everything. If your identity creates your emotional experience, then emotional freedom cannot be achieved by controlling other people. It can only be achieved by changing the identity experiencing them. That is the shift. That is the breakthrough. And this is where most people feel resistance. Because changing another person feels easier than changing yourself. Convincing someone to love you seems easier. Getting them back seems easier. Receiving more validation seems easier, at least in theory. But all of those strategies depend on circumstances remaining favorable. And circumstances are never fully under your control. Identity is not instantly, not effortlessly, but fundamentally. This is where emotional power begins returning. Not when another person behaves differently. When you stop treating their behavior as evidence of your worth. At first, this feels unnatural, almost impossible. Because for years you've been trained to measure yourself through external reactions. Perhaps you've noticed how automatic it is. Someone ignores you, immediately you feel smaller. Someone chooses someone else. Immediately you question yourself. Someone loses interest. Immediately you search for what is wrong with you. The reaction happens so quickly it feels like reality. But it isn't reality, it's conditioning. And conditioning can be changed. This realization creates an entirely different question, a much more powerful question. Instead of asking, why don't they choose me? You begin asking, why have I been treating their choice as the source of my value? That question changes everything because now attention shifts inward. Now the focus is on the root, not the symptom. And this is where true self concept work begins. Not with affirmations, not with positive thinking, not with pretending, but with honesty, radical honesty, the willingness to admit that you have been asking other people to provide something they were never capable of providing. Completion, security, worth, identity. No human being can permanently give you those things, even if they love you, even if they stay, even if they choose you every day. Because anything given externally can always be threatened externally. That is why so many people remain anxious, even inside relationships. The relationship exists, the fear remains, the validation exists, the insecurity remains. The attention exists, the dependency remains. Because the problem was never the absence of validation. The problem was dependence on validation. That distinction changes everything. Imagine someone handing you a glass of water when you're thirsty. Helpful, necessary, temporary. Now imagine believing that person is the source of all water, completely different experience. Now their absence becomes terrifying. Their withdrawal becomes catastrophic. Their behavior becomes a threat to survival. Many people unknowingly treat emotional validation this way, not as something enjoyable, as something necessary. And necessity creates dependency. This is why the most emotionally free people often love the deepest. Because they are no longer trying to extract identity from the relationship, they already possess it. They are not entering relationships to become whole. They are entering relationships already whole. That difference is invisible from the outside, but transformational from the inside. One person loves from lack, the other loves from fullness. One clings, the other connects. One fears loss constantly, the other appreciates without possession. One is searching for completion, the other is sharing completion. And here is the paradox. The thing most people chase through emotional dependency becomes available only after dependency ends, real connection, real intimacy, real love, because dependency creates pressure, love creates space. Biensi says, please complete me. Love says, I am complete and I choose to share my life with you. Dependency says, don't leave or I'll lose myself. Love says, I value you deeply, but I remain myself. Dependency fears absence. Love survives it. Dependency seeks ownership. Love seeks connection. The difference is profound. And once you see it, your understanding of relationships changes forever. Because the goal was never detachment from people. The goal was detachment from the belief that people determine your worth. That belief is the chain, not the person. Never the person, the chain is the assumption. And the moment that assumption begins breaking, emotional dependency starts losing its power. Not all at once, but inevitably. Because something inside you has finally awakened. The recognition that your value was never hiding inside another person's opinion. It was never located in their attention, their approval, their affection, or their presence. It was always yours, you simply forgot. And in the next part, we're going to explore how to reclaim that power practically, not theoretically, not philosophically, but through a transformation of identity so profound that the emotional patterns controlling your life begin dissolving from the inside out. The problem with most advice about emotional dependency is that it focuses on behavior, them their number. Stop checking their profile. Keep yourself busy. Meet new people. Distract yourself. Some of these things can help temporarily, but they rarely create lasting freedom because behaviors are branches, self concept is the root, and when the root remains unchanged, the branches eventually grow back. This is why people often experience the same emotional patterns with different people. Different face, same attachment. Different relationship, same anxiety. Different circumstances, same fear. The names change, the identity remains. And identity always wins. Perhaps you've noticed this in your own life. Maybe there was a time when you thought one particular person was the problem. Then the relationship ended. You eventually recovered. You moved on. Only to discover that the same emotional patterns appeared again with someone else. The same need for reassurance, the same fear of losing them, the same overthinking, the same emotional roller coaster, different person, same experience. Why? Because the emotional dependency was never attached to the person, it was attached to the self concept. And this is where transformation begins. Not by changing who you pursue, by changing who you believe yourself to be. Most people try to become more confident by controlling their emotions. But confidence is not emotional control. Confidence is identity stability. It is the ability to remain connected to your own worth regardless of temporary circumstances. This doesn't mean you never feel disappointed, you do. It doesn't mean rejection becomes pleasant, it doesn't. It doesn't mean loss stops hurting. It won't. It means your emotional experience no longer determines your identity, and that changes everything. Think about how most people approach self worth. They treat it like a reward. Something earned, something granted, something received. If enough people approve of them, they feel worthy. If enough people admire them, they feel valuable. If enough people choose them, they feel important. But what makes this difficult is that anything dependent on external approval remains fragile, because external approval can always disappear. And when it disappears, so does the identity built upon it. This is why some of the most admired people in the world still struggle with insecurity. While violation does not cure self doubt, it often masks it temporarily. The deeper solution is different. You stop treating worth as a conclusion and start treating it as a starting point. That single shift changes how you experience everything. Imagine two people entering a relationship. One enters believing, I hope this relationship proves that I am enough. The other enters believing, I already know I am enough. The external behavior may look similar at first, but internally they are worlds apart. One is negotiating for value, the other is expressing value. One is seeking completion, the other is sharing completion. One is afraid, the other is grounded. And over time, those differences become impossible to hide because identity always reveals itself. Now, here's where many people misunderstand self concept work. They think it means convincing yourself of something untrue, pretending acting, forcing positive thoughts. That is not what we're talking about. In fact, forced positivity often strengthens insecurity. Because underneath the positive words, the old identity remains untouched. Real self concept work is not about adding something, it is about removing something, specifically, removing the false belief that your worth must be earned through external validation. The moment that belief weakens, emotional freedom begins emerging naturally. Not because you're trying to detach, because there is less to detach from. The chain itself is disappearing. Perhaps you've noticed something interesting about emotionally secure people. They are often easier to be around. They don't constantly seek reassurance. They don't require endless proof. They don't monitor every interaction for signs of rejection. Why? Because they are no longer fighting an internal battle for worth. That battle has already been resolved internally. And when that happens, relationships become lighter, more natural, more authentic. This brings us to a practical shift that most people overlook. Stop asking, what are they thinking about me? Start asking, what am I assuming about myself? That question is transformative because your assumptions create your emotional reality. If you assume you're easy to replace, you'll interpret situations differently. If you assume you're not enough, you'll notice evidence supporting that belief. If you assume you're unworthy of love, you'll unconsciously search for confirmation. Not because reality is against you, because perception follows identity. And this is where emotional dependency quietly begins losing its grip. You stop chasing evidence. You stop collecting proof. You stop treating every interaction as a verdict on your value. Instead, you begin observing your own assumptions, not judging them, not fighting them, observing them. Because awareness is where change begins. The strange thing is that most people spend years studying other people. analyzing them, trying to understand them. Meanwhile, they remain strangers to themselves. They know what someone else wants, what someone else fears, what someone else thinks, but they have never truly examined the assumptions running their own life. And until they do, emotional dependency remains invisible. This is why self awareness is not merely a personal development concept. It's freedom, the ability to see the pattern while it is happening, the ability to notice the moment you start seeking worth externally, the ability to recognize when fear begins writing the story. That awareness interrupts the cycle, and every interruption weakens the old identity. Now something remarkable begins happening. The person who once seemed emotionally overwhelming starts looking different. Not because they changed. You changed, you begin seeing them more clearly, without projection, without desperation, without the emotional distortion created by dependency. And suddenly, things that once felt catastrophic no longer hold the same power. A delayed message becomes a delayed message, not a statement about your worth. A disagreement becomes a disagreement, not evidence of rejection. This becomes distance, not proof of abandonment. The event remains the same, the interpretation changes. And interpretation changes experience. This is why emotional freedom often feels subtle. It doesn't arrive as excitement, it arrives as peace, as space, as the absence of constant emotional noise. You stop checking, stop chasing, stop monitoring, stop needing. And perhaps for the first time, you experience what genuine emotional independence feels like. Not indifference, not coldness, not detachment from life, freedom. The freedom that comes from no longer requiring another person to confirm who you are. And once that freedom begins developing, something unexpected happens. You become capable of a kind of love that emotional dependency never allows. A love without fear, a love without possession, a love without constant negotiation. Because when identity is secure, connection becomes a choice rather than a necessity. And that changes the entire nature of every relationship you will ever have. But there is still one final piece, one final realization. Because emotional freedom is not merely about changing how you relate to others. It is about discovering something deeper, something that was there before every relationship, before every rejection, before every attachment, something that has remained untouched through all of it. And once you recognize it, the entire foundation of emotional dependency collapses, not through effort, but through understanding. There is one final truth about emotional dependency that almost nobody talks about. Not because it is complicated, but because it is uncomfortable. The uncomfortable truth is this: the person you couldn't let go of was never carrying your power. You were the entire time. It only appeared as though they possessed it. And that illusion changes the moment you understand something fundamental about human experience. Every relationship eventually asks the same question: not whether someone loves you, not whether they stay, not whether they choose you. The deeper question is this: who are you when those things are uncertain? That question reveals everything. Because certainty is easy, almost anyone can feel secure when circumstances are favorable, when the messages arrive, when the affection is obvious, when the relationship feels stable. The real test comes when certainty disappears, because uncertainty exposes identity. It reveals what was already there beneath the surface. Perhaps you've noticed this. Two people experience the same situation. One collapses emotionally, the other remains grounded. One interprets uncertainty as danger, the other interprets uncertainty as part of life. One becomes consumed by fear, the other remains connected to themselves. The difference is rarely circumstances, the difference is identity. And this is where the deepest transformation occurs, not when life becomes predictable. When you stop requiring predictability to feel whole, write that again, because this is the shift that changes everything. Most people spend years trying to control the external world, trying to control outcomes, trying to control relationships, trying to control how others feel about them, trying to control what cannot truly be controlled. Meanwhile, they overlook the only thing that has always been available to them: their relationship with themselves. The strange thing is that emotional dependency often disguises itself as devotion, as passion, as deep love, but underneath it is usually fear: fear of losing validation, fear of losing certainty, Fear of losing identity. Fear of losing a version of yourself that only exists when someone else confirms it. And this is why emotional dependency feels so painful, because it creates a fragile self. A self constantly waiting for permission to feel worthy. A self constantly looking outward for answers that can only be found inward. But eventually a moment arrives, a moment when you become exhausted. Exhausted from monitoring, exhausted from chasing, exhausted from wondering, exhausted from needing. And in that exhaustion, something powerful becomes possible. You stop asking them to save you. You stop asking them to complete you. You stop asking them to prove your worth, not because you become bitter, not because you stop caring, because you finally understand they were never responsible for carrying that weight. No human being is. The need itself was the burden, not the person. And once that becomes clear, relationships begin changing naturally. You stop approaching people from deficiency. You stop approaching them from fear. You stop approaching them from emotional hunger. Instead, you begin approaching them from wholeness. Not perfect wholeness, not flawless confidence, simply a growing awareness that your value exists independently of their response. This changes how you communicate, how you connect, how you love, how you experience loss. Because now another person's behavior can affect your emotions without defining your identity. That distinction is freedom. You can feel disappointment without becoming worthless. You can experience rejection without becoming inadequate. You can feel sadness without becoming broken. You can lose someone without losing yourself. And perhaps that is what emotional maturity really is. Not the absence of emotion, the absence of self abandonment. Most people think emotional strength means feeling less. In reality, emotional strength means remaining connected to yourself while feeling deeply. That is a completely different thing. The emotionally free person is not cold, not detached from life, not disconnected from love. They simply no longer confuse love with dependency. They no longer confuse attention with worth. They no longer confuse validation with identity. And because of that, they become capable of something extraordinary. They become capable of loving without fear, not because they believe nobody will leave, because they know they will remain whole even if someone does. That is real security, not certainty, self trust. And this brings us back to the beginning. You may have started this journey believing another person was the source of your pain, believing they held the key, believing their return would finally create peace. But now perhaps you can see something different. The peace you were searching for was never hidden inside another person. It was hidden beneath the belief that another person determines your worth. The moment that belief begins dissolving, everything changes. Not overnight, not instantly, but steadily. You stop giving away your power. You stop negotiating your value. You stop asking others to answer questions that only you can answer. And gradually a new identity emerges. An identity built on something far more stable than approval, far more stable than attention, far more stable than circumstances. An identity built on self possession. This is what Neville was pointing toward when he spoke about self concept. Not a technique, not a trick, not a shortcut, a transformation of identity, a recognition of who you are beneath fear, beneath attachment, beneath dependency. Beneath every story that convinced you your worth was uncertain, because the truth is that your value was never waiting to be granted. It was never waiting to be discovered in another person's affection. It was never hidden inside their approval. It was never located in their choice. Your value existed before they arrived. It remained while they were present. And it will remain regardless of what happens next. That has always been true. The only thing that changes is whether you recognize it. So if there is one thing to carry with you after this video, let it be this. The goal is not to stop loving. The goal is not to become detached from people. The goal is not emotional numbness. The goal is to become so deeply rooted in your own self-concept that no relationship is forced to carry the burden of your identity. Because when that happens, something remarkable emerges. Love becomes lighter, conscience becomes deeper, fear becomes quieter. And for the first time, you stop asking another person to tell you who you are. You already know. And that knowledge is the end of emotional dependency. Not because you no longer care, because you no longer need another person to complete what was never incomplete.